From Diamond Pharmacy and Optics, this is PodcastRx with Chris Bender. When he's not on the mic, Chris is a clinical pharmacist with the Office of Pharmacy Therapeutics and Integrated Clinical Services, or Optics. He routinely helps providers in correctional and long-term care facilities make better medication decisions to improve patient care. And we're so happy that he's sharing his expertise with you.
Hoping that today can be a real knowledge booster.
A classic Batman and Robin or Jordan and Pippin type scenario.
A full armamentarium of options that clinicians can choose from.
On this bonus episode, Chris outlines all the necessary vaccine information related to COVID-19, influenza, RSV, and pneumonia ahead of the respiratory disease season. And afterwards, we bring you a fun new segment called Trivia Capsule, where we learn some amazing pharmacy facts about variolation, the historical precursor to vaccination. I'm Adam Campbell, and thank you for listening.
All right. Well, welcome to a surprise bonus episode of PodcastRx with Chris Bender. Kind of interesting to have a surprise bonus episode when we're only one episode in. Chris, your reputation and clout is such that you're already getting a special bonus just one episode in. How does that feel?
Feel like Pearl Jam getting the one more song chant as I leave the stage. Feels great.
Pearl Jam, interesting choice. All right.
Little throwback.
Yeah, I like it. Well, all joking aside, the truth is that we recorded way too much content for the debut episode, and it simply made sense to break it into separate, more manageable chunks for easier listening. So, it's September, and football, autumn, pumpkin spice lattes, they aren't the only seasons that get started in September. The respiratory disease season, with its quad pillars of COVID-19, influenza, RSV, and pneumonia, also gets underway as the temperatures get cooler and we all start to spend more time indoors. Chris, I think you have some experience with this today, actually.
Yeah, in case listeners can't tell, I have started my respiratory disease season a bit early this year. So just now getting over the weather from being under the weather.
Oh, you sound good, man. You sound good.
Thank you.
I'm glad you're feeling better. But Chris, we just observed National Immunization Month in August. So with vaccines and respiratory diseases top of mind, I wanted to ask what key pieces of clinical information providers should know about as we head into sick season.
Well, yeah, as you already spoke to it, this is a busy time of year when it comes to respiratory diseases and vaccination. But I feel like it's been particularly busy lately. We've had some new vaccine approvals, some expanded indications, and some updated recommendations. There's a lot of information, but to keep it all straight, let's kind of walk through one disease state at a time, okay? So
sounds good.
Cool. So for COVID-19, the CDC recommends that everyone ages 6 months and older receive an updated 2024-2025 COVID-19 vaccine, regardless of whether they have been previously vaccinated. These vaccines will be monovalent KP2 lineage vaccines to more closely resemble the dominant strain circulating at the community at this time. For influenza, the CDC recommends everyone 6 months and older, with rare exceptions, receive an updated 2024-2025 flu vaccine. Updated 2024-2025 flu vaccines will all be trivalent and will include an H1N1 strain, an updated H3N2 strain, and a B Victoria lineage-like virus. Now, the vaccine composition changed from quadrivalent to trivalent since a component of the previous quadrivalent vaccines, that being the B Yamagata flu virus, hasn't been in circulation since March of 2020. The CDC also confirmed that it is safe to receive COVID-19 and flu vaccines at the same time. So next time you're at your pharmacy, why not just do one-stop shop and get them done at the same time?
Chris, really quickly, and perhaps our listeners don't need this, but I do. A quick refresher on valence, bivalent, quadrivalent, and so on.
Yeah, that's a good level set. So valent is really just referring to the number of, valent is referring to the vaccine strain or the viral strain in the vaccine. So in the case of monovalent, that means there's one strain of virus in that vaccine. Bivalent, there are two strains of vaccine two strains of virus in that vaccine. And trivalent, there are three strains of virus in that vaccine, and so on, so forth.
Easy enough. Thank you, sir.
Perfect. So next, for RSV, there have actually been a few developments here. Moderna's mRNA-based vaccine called mRESVIA has been approved to protect against RSV-associated lower respiratory tract disease, basically meaning getting sick from RSV, in adults 60 years and older. It's the third vaccine for this indication. It joins Abrezvo and RXV as the three vaccines for RSV. Now, they haven't been studied against one another, but efficacy appears similar between these vaccines. Common adverse reactions are similar as well, and these include fatigue, headache, myalgia, and arthralgia. Of note, no cases of acute disseminated encephalomyelitis, Guillain-Barré syndrome, or atrial fibrillation have been reported with mRESVIA, this new one, which is important as these conditions have been associated to varying degrees with RXV and or Abrezvo. There has been one case of facial paralysis seen with mRESVIA, however. Now, in other RSV news, RXV, one of the three vaccines, was granted an expanded indication. So it now includes adults aged 50 to 59 with risk factors. Keep in mind that the other two, Abrezvo and mRESVIA, are still only indicated for adults 60 years and older. Now, the thing is, though, this expanded indication is likely irrelevant, however, as the CDC only recommends vaccination for those 60 and older. Specifically, in their updated recommendations, the CDC recommends that all adults 75 and older definitely be vaccinated, as well as those who are 60 to 74 who have an increased risk for severe RSV. So these would include those with chronic medical conditions, such as heart or lung disease, or those residing in facilities like nursing homes.
I do want to say that RXV is a great bit of drug naming.
It really is. It really brings the disease to mind.
It really does. It really does. But I do want to ask Chris, why the expanded indication for RXV if it's irrelevant in light of CDC recommendations?
Yeah, it seems a little silly, doesn't it? But it's actually not. It's actually not the first time that we've seen this type of discrepancy when it comes to vaccines. To kind of understand this, we have to remember that the FDA and the CDC are separate entities, of course, different panel members, different goals in ways. So the FDA tends to take a more narrow approach for approval of a drug or a vaccine, as in, did that drug, or in this case, a vaccine, provide benefit in the population in which it was studied? However, they don't always consider the magnitude of that benefit. So in this case, the clinical trial assessed whether RXV would provide comparable antibody levels in the 50 to 59-year-old population as it does in those aged 60 and older. And it did. So it got approved. It did what it set out to prove. The trial did not, however, assess whether that resulted in lower rates of RSV-associated respiratory symptoms in that younger population. And that's where the CDC's recommendations come in. So kind of in a different approach, the CDC takes a bird's eye view and they ask, in which populations does this intervention provide the most benefit from like an overall public health perspective? And based on their recommendations, they believed that RSV vaccination doesn't provide enough net benefit in that younger population to warrant a recommendation. Not at least right now. That could always change, but based on my understanding of the data and reading of their recommendations, they're starting to push RSV recommendations more toward an older population, not necessarily, or an older or more severe population, not necessarily a younger population. So it'll be interesting to see if that changes in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks for clearing that up, Chris.
Yeah. And then finally, we have pneumococcal vaccination, where a newly approved vaccine known as Capvaxive will bring better protection, but possibly additional confusion. So for a quick review, there are over 100 known pneumococcal serotypes, or strains, if you want to think about it that way. But these are bacteria, so they're considered serotypes. But only a minority of those serotypes cause the majority of pneumococcal infections. So we now have 4 pneumococcal vaccines for adults. We have 3 conjugate vaccines and 1 polysaccharide vaccine. So generally speaking, conjugate vaccines induce a more robust immune response, and they're now preferred. Unfortunately, with so many serotypes, no one vaccine can cover them all, which is why we have 3 different conjugate vaccines covering varying serotypes. We have Vaxneuvance. Yeah.
Oh, Chris, I just wanted to interject really quickly here to note that
Yeah.
you give a great breakdown of serotypes and pneumococcal vaccines in episode 28 of PodcastRx. Just a little self-referential shout out here, but in case the listeners are interested, Chris does talk about this more at length in episode 28. Carry on.
Yeah. Great callback. Feels like ages ago, but that was a good show. So we have 3 different conjugate vaccines. We have Vaxneuvance, which covers 15 serotypes, Prevnar 20, which, true to its name, covers 20 serotypes, and now Capvaxive, which covers 21. Side note, I kind of miss when all of them had the number by their name. Now we're getting newer ones that is just a brand name, and now I have to remember which contains how many. That's why I like Prevnar, because it always says the number next to its name. But anyway, so what could potentially set Capvaxive apart is that it includes more of the serotypes that are responsible for invasive disease compared to either Vaxneuvance or Prevnar 20, meaning that it could provide more robust protection. Unfortunately, the only clinical trial data that we have regarding this vaccine shows that it induces an immune response to those 21 serotypes, but no data regarding its effect on actual pneumococcal infection rates. So going to be interesting to see if that advantage actually pans out. So far, the CDC recommends Capvaxive as an option for adults aged 19 years and older who currently have a recommendation to receive a dose of pneumococcal vaccine, but they have yet to provide any guidance regarding if it should be given to those who have previously received pneumococcal vaccination. So hopefully, forthcoming updated recommendations will help show us how to employ it, because I know in the past, people who previously received Prevnar 13 eventually got recommended to receive either Vaxneuvance or Prevnar 20 because those ones were more robust. So in my opinion, if I had to guess, it seems as though they would ultimately recommend getting Capvaxive on top of a previous dose of Vaxneuvance or Prevnar 20. But again, that's purely speculation. It'll just be interesting to see where they go from here.
It's a very logical speculation. Well, Chris, I want to thank you for that great roundup of all the respiratory disease states that we have to be concerned about as we head into 6th season. And again, we're going to post links to all the material Chris discusses in each episode in the show notes. So plenty more links to get further reading on these topics. So we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back.
Everyone knows that pharmacists dispense medication. But the clinical pharmacists in Diamond Pharmacy's optics team dispense more potent resources, information, and education. The optics pharmacists are frontline medication experts for Diamond's many institutional partners. Whether you work as a provider in corrections or long-term care, the optics team is standing by to answer your on-demand medication questions. But optics is far more than a drug information hotline. They also create proactive knowledge resources like webinars and this podcast to keep partners up to speed with the latest drug developments. And they help providers to better manage costs and therapeutic outcomes with their in-house medication surveillance monitoring program. Learn more about the optics team by going to diamondpharmacy.com and clicking the Clinical Support tab. See pharmacy care more clearly with optics. Let's get back to PodcastRx.
All right, well, this special bonus episode, we're going to end it like we did the debut episode of PodcastRx with Chris Bender. We're going to do something fun and lighthearted. And I think we have something here that perfectly encapsulates Chris's penchant for pharmacy nerdery and delivering entertaining content. And because we can't resist lighthearted pharmacy puns, at least I can't, we're calling this Trivia Capsule, where you learn about an amazing pharmacy fact you never thought to ask about. And this was actually a segment that we had developed for an in-house podcast here at Diamond Pharmacy that Chris did for about a year. And it's good to resurrect it here on this show because you really do learn a lot, and it's a lot of fun. And I'm so glad you wanted to bring it back, Chris. So what are we going to learn about in this month's trivia capsule?
Yeah, I'm glad that we're doing this again. So in the spirit of today's discussion, let's look at the history of vaccination. Now, I'm sure if you've frequented some trivia nights, you may be quick to say, hey, Edward Jenner did it. But did you know that vaccination was actually predated by variolation? So variolation was a practice developed in Asia in the 16th century that involved introducing smallpox matter from an infected individual to an uninfected individual to induce immunity in that uninfected individual. In one method, smallpox scabs would be dried and then inhaled by the uninfected individual. In another method, pustule material would be obtained from the individual recovering from smallpox and then scratched into the arm of an uninfected individual. In most cases, the person receiving variolation would develop less severe symptoms of smallpox and then would go on to be immune from future exposure. This was not without risk, however, as inadvertent variolation with the more potent form of smallpox, that being variola major, could not only cause death in the individual, but could also trigger epidemics. This practice was discovered and was widely adopted throughout the 18th century in North America, Britain, and Russia. Heck, even General George Washington employed mass variolation on his army during the Revolutionary War in 1776. 20 years later, Edward Jenner would go on to refine this process using cowpox, which is related to smallpox but less deadly. This safer method quickly replaced variolation and became known as vaccination, named after the cowpox virus vaccinia, which derives from the Latin word for cow.
Well, Chris, as previous episodes can attest, I know you could talk about vaccination until the cows come home. And with that does it for this bonus episode of PodcastRx with Chris Bender. Chris, once again, can't thank you enough for taking this on, and I'm greatly looking forward to our October show.
Absolutely.
Look forward to talking with you soon, Chris, and enjoy your September.
Hey, likewise. You take care.
PodcastRx features conversations with healthcare professionals. The statements and opinions discussed herein are for informational purposes only. This podcast should not be considered professional medical advice and should not be used as the substitute for the advice of an appropriately qualified and licensed healthcare professional. Therefore, listeners must not rely on the statements made herein.
PodcastRx is a production of Diamond Pharmacy Services. Find our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you enjoy podcasts. And where possible, please rate and review. If you'd like to get in touch with the show directly, shoot us an email at podcastrx@diamondpharmacy.com. Thank you again for your support.